I think it's really integral to understand this, right? So here's like the final summary to kind of like all the points I'm making, which is this, okay? And I am going to need to whip out the paint on this one. Just draw a fucking box. Tom Soraka. So we've got Poro Cannon, we've got Jury Rig. It's a nice opener. And you know what? We actually really like Battlecaster here. I think we can kick the Jinx and just try to get like a little bit more Swarm compatibility. I like Crowd Favorite over Jinx in these early stages. We've got some, some nice tools here. We can go ahead and start developing, our board presence already. Part of the reason Poro Cannon is so good in this deck, by the way, is like when you think about what this card offers this deck, it is multiple things. Poro Cannon is a Swarm card, and it is a discard card, which makes it categorically insane. That's crazy. Because it can be used for the Swarm part of the combo, or it can be used for the Swarm payoff part of the combo. It's impossible to describe how big of a deal that is. Because the whole deck is like hinged on trying to draw the right half of the cards together, and Poro Cannon is flexibly either half. Again, insane. Absolutely ridiculous. So we have to think like, we have to either play House Spider or Battlecaster this turn. We have to think like, we're probably going to play them both before our next attack. So what's the draw that makes us not play both of them? If I were to draw Draven, I might actually play it instead of House Spider here. Whereas if I play House Spider, there's kind of nothing I'm going to draw that makes me, the Battlecaster just ends up making more sense. I could even draw like, I don't know if I would Zonite here. It's a pretty good hand for him. He's got like the kind of accelerator he needs. Yeah, so here's Zonite Urchin. We're probably just going to go as wide as humanly possible. What we could also do is try to make his Krusty Codger not a great blocker, right? What we're going to do is let's get reactivity on this board, right? So check this out. Like, we don't want to Zonite yet. We're going to either House Spider or Battlecaster, but we do know we're going to Poro. And he also sees we've got a Poro in our hand. Let's play Poro first, and then maybe his play will actually inform whether we're House Spider or Battlecastering. So he's passing. The benefit of playing Battlecaster over House Spider is basically we give him no good blocks, right? Because whatever he would use to block the Codger, like the Scuttler will go to 3 attack off of both Battlecasters, and the Battlecasters will give each other 3 attacks. And the ability to threaten the Codger is a big deal. And he can't really protect that with anything. So I actually really just like playing the other Battlecaster here. He can't efficiently protect it. He can use Pale or Guiding Touch, but those are not great for him here. And this is kind of like the only board I want. So we have no good block for his Codger without having to use a trick, which I'm fine with because then he's committing resources. Hope you enjoy your rest. Your content is amazing. I like my content sometimes and I really don't like it at others. Like, I feel good right now. I'm kind of like I've had real problems controlling my brain lately. It's like some days I'm just in such a crazy slump, and some days I feel like I'm, lit up. And it's really, and I think a lot of people are like this, where it's like you just need to be able to kind of identify a pattern and min-max what works best for you. But I feel good right now. I wish, and this is kind of like part of what I'm going to work towards, but I'm going to try to like figure out what the patterns are and how to like, optimize this. Is your sugar intake high? No. He's got Brokeback Protector, a pretty scary card. So now let's think as we always do about like whether we're, whether we don't want him developing into us. Like whether we're going to play the Crowd Favorite this turn and lose, the maximum stat, or whether we're going to play it, maybe next turn. What that's going to mean for us. Having that little point of HP actually matters. He doesn't really have a valuable attack here at all. Like having the +1/+1 matters. And honestly, my board going as wide as possible per attack really matters too. He's not running TF, and which is an important aspect of this decision, right? Because like he can't actually punish me developing, right? Which is a big deal. So what that means is I actually might be totally fine just playing like a House Spider here. It's Depression or something like that. Yeah, no, I'm checking out all the options. It very possibly could be, one similar thing. Because that can really happen. So like check out what's happening here. I'm thinking, well, obviously you have to plan ahead. You have to think one turn ahead. And I'm thinking to myself, and I might be mistaken in my logic, but my reasoning is that deck doesn't really run a ton of development punishers. What are development punishers? Usually it's a card that at slow speed swings 2 combats. So that's like Iceveil Archer, Arachnoid Sentry, or just something that plays 2 units, like Petty Officer or House Spider. His deck kind of runs none of those, and so, and no TF either. You know, nothing at slow speed that's crazy. So what I'll do is I'll try to, like, you know, maximize the value on this attack, I think, by playing the crowd favorite after. We're losing the spider forever, the 1/1 spider forever, but the 1/1 spider actually kind of can't matter here. Like, I just played the house spider last turn as a 2/2, and I could have played Zonai Urchin instead, but I actually value Zonai Urchin's flexibility of unbreaking hands more than I value the extra 1/1. If you look at how this game is going, like, we're not running out of steam. We've got augmented to replenish our board one last time. We just want to push for, like, the final bit of damage, right? So, you know, last turn, we're thinking, okay, do we play for maximum value on the attack? What we did so when you look at these 2 actions, it's not just crowd favorite getting the +1/+1. It's also us getting House Spider. And House Spider is important because it's a 4/2, right? It's a 4/2 because we have the Battlecasters. So we're getting a 4/2 and we're getting an extra +1/+1 on a crowd favorite. And the only downside is we give him an action. What's his action? Well, in this case, it's just Star Shepherd, which is a nothing action, which means we get rewarded. We made the, well, we can't say we made the correct play, but within the context of this game's result, we did what we needed to do. And this is actually a lot of you guys, you know, ask about ratioing. We were talking about it before. And you guys know I was running 2 Tahm Kench, 1 Twisted Fate. Well, this is part of the reason for that. Even a single Twisted Fate might have made me play that differently, because its presence in the deck, especially visibly, means it is something you have to be aware of. Even at, like, somewhat low odds, that, as a huge punisher, even at low odds, that has to be something that's in my mind. So, like, and that's why it depends on the meta, but there's nothing really wrong with ratioing, like, 2 Tahm Kench, 1 Twisted Fate like that. That's why I like using that. So, you know, we want to Augmented Experimenter for maximum value. It looks like we kind of want to do it as early as possible, so we can just Zonite the Draven's Big Fan. We draw a Jinx, which is, I guess, a good draw. It means we have to play Jinx before the Augmented, but can't be a bad draw here. And our deck should just kind of run us over. I'm kind of wondering if Starspring is a bait as a card. I actually think the deck might do better if you just cut it completely, which is something I theorized early on. Like, when we were theory crafting the deck and building it, I was like, let's cut Starspring. And honestly, the way I see these games play out, like, every time the Soraka Tahm deck does well, it's off of not having Starspring and just winning off of Tahm. And part of that is because I've been playing a lot of discard aggro in just the last couple of days. But Starspring is just really not threatening at all. Especially when you draw multiple copies of Starspring, it ends up being kind of a lose condition. I could see versions of this deck cutting down on it, or maybe cutting it entirely. Which is another thing we did when we were theory crafting. You might remember when I was building, like, Starspring deck with Kuvira before the patch hit. It only lasted like 30 minutes. We kind of canceled the deck build really fast on that one. But we were basically... we ended up taking Starspring down to a 1-of. Which looks super weird. Doesn't that look weird? Because it's, in theory, it's a high synergy card. Running a 1-of a high synergy card, that's so bizarre. Now, the question is, do we develop into this attack? Or do we just maybe attack as is? This attack doesn't, you know, really get too much better by developing in. He could actually do enough of a blocker for it to matter. I think in this case, we'll attack in and then rely on our potential over the top after. The one downside is our Jinx does have the ability... If we go in now, we actually might not be able to protect our Jinx. Let's go for the Augmented Experimenter first, actually. Let's do this. It's a little weird. This might not be the correct play. It's a very weird play to do, for sure. So he's playing Tahm Kench. That's good. That's kind of what we wanted, because it means, you know, he doesn't have the ability to... well, it depends on what we draw, but he might not have the ability to stop, like, a rocket from coming in after. So, you know, we can push a little bit more damage. We do need to damage one of these. We are going to have to hit the undamaged one just in case he has Guiding Touch. I guess he would Guiding Touch face anyway, so you could hit the other 2-3. It shouldn't matter. And, I mean, I feel like we should be pretty good here. Wow, that's a sick draw. Holy shit. Sonnet Vision. What the hell just happened? Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm getting off that. Honestly, it's kind of crazy though. He could actually have another blocker if I develop, and if he plays another blocker, then my Zonite Vision actually can get a little bit punished. We are getting like 2 damage guaranteed though, even against the other blocker. Yeah, I have to do it. I actually have to do it. This Zonite Vision is actually just too crazy. We just had too crazy of a nut draw. The question is, does he have enough blockers? Like, my Poro might not be mattering. Because, you know, our board is wider than his, right? Like, he's not really able to block my Zonite anyway. So in this scenario, we actually don't want the Poro. We actually just want to play for the maximum stats here. So let's actually override the Poro and take the best attack we can here, right? This is kind of like our final attack, and it should be enough to basically end the game. The Vision does mean, you know, he can't Soraka block the Jinx, which, you know, I don't know if he wanted to do anyway. But either way, we're just kind of maximizing our damage here. That feels really good. So yeah, I was talking more about Starspring. You know, we were talking about ratioing last game and when you should run 3-ofs and when you should run 1-ofs. Let's talk a little bit deeper about that with like the Tahm Kench Soraka deck, you know? So the biggest reason to run a high quantity of things, here's the biggest reason. This is kind of like an older version. I think Broadback to Protector, we have to go back to running Broadback to Protector. So don't focus. I can make some changes like 2 Astral. We can run Broadback to over Hunting Fleet because like it's just so much better against the meta right now. You have to run it against like all the aggression right now, which is where we started the deck. We started with 3 Broadback to Protector, and then we cut it for Hunting Fleet just because in the early days there or specifically day 1 there wasn't enough aggro. Now there's enough that yeah, I'm gonna want to run more Broadback to Protectors. So it doesn't matter the exact build, but let's take a look at some of the specific ratioing that's going on here and about how we talked about it last game. Because it's super counterintuitive. So cards are a lot of things. A lot of people say the phrase, you want to run 3-ofs to make your deck more consistent. And that they're either using the word consistent in a very weird way. They mean a different word. Or it's completely nonsense. Because it's not consistency that you're going for per se. The reason you want to run 3-ofs is to abuse cards that have a higher power level, basically. Or if they are combo pieces, which the majority of the cards aren't combo pieces, but if they're combo pieces, then yes, the combo pieces, you can maximize the consistency. If there's no other potential card that could fulfill that niche, then you are maximizing your consistency of that combo by maxing your quantity. But that's all a lot of asterisks. Okay. And deck building cost matters a lot. There's a lot of cards that we can really only run as a high quantity there's a lot of cards that you can't run as a 1-of or a 2-of just because they have deck building costs. So, you know what? Let's use a better example for this actually. Let's take I think a great example for this is the Lee Sin Zed deck actually. So someone asked me a great question when I was playing in the tournament an hour ago. Someone asked me a great question, which is like, you know, Diana's good. What if we ran 2 Diana, 1 Zed? Because Zed is really bad to double draw because it gets a complete brick as a spell. Like you actually, I say complete brick. It's not literally useless, but it's pretty close, right? Zed is pretty bad to double draw. You know, so why don't we run 2 Diana, 1 Zed? Well, there's a couple issues with that. The most obvious issue is even though Zed is bad to double draw, Diana is great to double draw. Getting more Pale Cascades is actually part of the reason we're running Diana. So cutting down on the quantity isn't great. But another really big thing in Diana is that she has a deck building cost that we need to synergize with, right? And it can't not. To run Diana, we have to run Lunari Duskbringer. Not necessarily as a 3-of. Some versions run 2. But it's, part of the synergy. Dusk Petal Dust it seems kind of weird, but just having the fact that it's a spell for Lee is kind of why this works the way it does. And the deck needs a 1-drop anyway. And so if I cut down on ratios of Diana, then I'm hurting the Duskbringer that's already in my deck. Now what I could do is cut down on ratios of both. But then the problem is because it's a kind of a pocket combo that we want to play for, if I cut down on ratios of Duskbringer just to match the fact that we cut down on ratios of Diana, then I'm drawing the pocket combo less reliably, right? Because, you know, each half multiplies out, and you get less reliability of the total. Here's another issue, because it's actually not just Duskbringer. It's not just Duskbringer that's the deck building cost of Diana. I think a lot of people think that it might be. It's also Sonic Wave and even to a degree Mentor. Sonic Wave is good with Diana to the degree that part of the reason we're able to run 3 Sonic Wave instead of 2 is because we're running 3 Diana. We have extra targets. The same is true for Mentor of the Stones. Part of the reason we're able to run 3 Mentor, some versions are running 2. It could be right to run 3 either way, but part of the reason we're running 3 is because it has a good synergy with Diana. It just gives us an additional buff target that curves with Mentor. With Mentor, you really need a 2 mana unit or a 4 mana unit. And most things you want to buff for 3 mana units, which is super awkward with Mentor. It's like buffing Zed or buffing Tasty. Like, it doesn't fit together really super well in every case. So Diana has a pretty big deck building cost here. She's worth it, but it does mean part of her ratioing, you know, she's got a great double draw, amazing double draw, Pale Cascade. This is actually one of the strongest traits of champions in the entire game, because cards, when you draw them, have very majorly diminishing returns. People don't talk about this at all. People don't talk about this at all. This is the single strongest component. This is the single reason why champions are better than other cards. Because when you double draw them, you have a different card. This is the fundamental downside of running 3-ofs. And this is the problem with the consistency argument. Again, consistency can apply with a lot of asterisks. It's just a bad word to use in that scenario, honestly, because it's kind of misleading. The problem with the consistency argument is that this is your deck, okay? This is your deck. It's got 40 cards. You're running 40 cards. I wouldn't run 41 cards because that would make my deck less consistent, because then I'd be drawing, every draw would be into 41 cards instead of 40. Lower quantity of deck size is more consistent because that's less cards. That's good. Here's the problem. No matter what we do to the deck, it's still going to be 40 cards. It might be 17 different cards if we run a lot of 3-ofs, but it's going to be 40 cards. Here's the difference. The first copy of a card you draw is fundamentally very different value from the second copy of the card you draw. In almost every case. And it's almost always heavy diminishing returns. Heavy diminishing returns. Like, if I draw 1 Grizzled Ranger, I'm just going to pick a random fucking example in a different region. If I draw 1 Grizzled Ranger, I have a 4 mana 3/1. It does everything it says. If I draw a second Grizzled Ranger, it's a lot worse. It's a lot worse. I can never play the second one until after I've played the first one, and that means I can't play it on turn 4. It's not giving me any additional actions or options per turn. It is a much worse card. It is not the same card. They are 2 different cards. The first Ranger you draw and the second Ranger you draw are very different cards. They do completely different things to the game. And there's a lot of cards that you don't want to double draw, right? Now, it depends on the card. Most cards have diminishing returns to double draw. Champions that have bad champion spell cards like Zed, you don't want to double draw. There are some cards that arguably have some amount of accelerating returns when you double draw, and this is where some of the champions come in. Like, the second Diana I draw is sometimes more valuable than the first Diana I draw. How crazy is that? That's crazy. That's nuts. And a lot of champions are like that. Swain is like that too. You know, any champion that has a good champ spell, that's such a big component. The fact that they get to run 6 Flux is insane, right? It's insane. And it's part of how that deck functions. The second Swain they play is a Flock instead of a Swain. And that's so good because you don't want a second Swain when you have a Swain on board, right? So you really have to think about deck building in that way. Different cards have different amounts of diminishing returns. And there's no easy rule of thumb. I have to say, just you have to kind of like play out the games in your head a little bit and think about how those diminishing returns are going to go and like how those cards will like pile up on some. Because there's some cards that double drawing them is absolutely horrendous. And there's some cards where the second copy might have slight diminishing returns, but nothing really major, right? But so what would be an example of a non-champion card that has accelerating returns, in a vacuum, that's really difficult. Usually this is where theoretical, like, it has to be like a narrow game plan, basically, for cards to have accelerating returns as opposed to diminishing returns. So when you're juggling the quantities of a card in your deck, what you're doing is you're fundamentally weighing kind of like two main factors. And there's a lot of factors, but there's two main factors. One factor is this idea of the base value of a card. You want to abuse nuts cards. That's easy. The second value is diminishing returns on drawing them, right? And there's other factors, a lot of other factors, but usually it's a race of, are these cards OP enough that drawing two of them feels good? Yes, that's a 3F. And that's how a lot of the starts of deck building is done. And there's kind of nothing card games can do around that to a degree. Like, even if you balance really well, there still will be a lot of 3Fs. What I can say is that on average, in a perfectly balanced game or a more balanced game, there will be more 1Fs and 2Fs. And that's because, again, we have those two fundamental notions of diminishing returns per draw fighting with just objective power level, right? That is true. If it's more balanced, there will be more 1Fs and 2Fs. It's a broad generalization. It doesn't really do much for you as a generalization, but it might help you understand how the probability of ratioing works, right? So now that we've kind of like talked about all of that, let's talk about what I was talking about in this deck, which is the idea of, you know what, it seems super weird, some of the ratioing. Like, I as far as I could see, I'm sure there were other people doing this just because nobody's unique. There's nothing new under the sun. But I didn't see anyone else running 2-Tom, 1 Twist of Fate. The reason for this is pretty straightforward. I kind of explained it during that game. You know, the Twisted Fate 1-of, it gives my deck a role that the deck needs. It's a role player, which is that it's a solid development punisher, basically. Which can mean a lot of things. It can be gold card or red card. It depends on the board state, but it means the opponent has to think before developing into me, which there's kind of nothing else in this deck that actually is a big development punisher. But also, Tahm Kench is powerful as a card. Double drawing it doesn't feel great, you know, with Bayou Brunch. And Tahm Kench does have a deck building cost, but it is shared with cards that are already in the deck, if that makes sense. And don't get me wrong, whether you run the 1 Twist of Fate or the third Tahm Kench as a meta call, I was running 3 Tahm Kench too. It just depends on what I'm running into. It's such a small, it's one card. It's not like a huge deal, but in some situations you will want to run 1 Twist of Fate instead. And the difference between Tahm Kench and Diana, a big one is Tahm Kench's champion card sucks. It's not useless, but it's not great, right? It's not like Pale Cascade, so double drawing Tahm Kench isn't as good. A big part of that, though, is that Tahm Kench doesn't have a committal deck building cost in this deck. By making my Tahm a 2-of instead of a 3-of, I'm not, at least in my opinion, I might be mistaken actually, but in this build of the deck at least, I thought did I forget to say if I was trying to like show better version with like the kind of like back to Astral broke back. But Tahm Kench didn't have as much of a committal deck building cost because all of these cards are kind of playing for alternate targets, right? Broad back to Protector. All of these cards are playing for alternate targets. Like, the fact that Tahm Kench goes to a 2-of in this list doesn't actually fundamentally really change how the list wants to be built. Like, the cards like Astral and Bastion are still working with Soraka. I think it should be effectively the same degree. I could see like cutting maybe one of them, and the win conditions in the matchups are all kind of the same. So don't get me wrong. If it's a meta where you need Tahm Kench to win games, then of course Tahm Kench is a 3-of. But it's not like it's going to be fundamentally necessarily a 3-of, right? And that lastly brings me to Starspring. And Starspring's a weird one because I just said the phrase, and if you're watching, I was saying that before when we were playtesting this concept of a deck, we were cutting Starspring down. We cut it to a 2-of, and then we cut it to a 1-of, and then we were thinking about cutting it completely just because we weren't sure about it as a card. So here's the thing about Starspring, which is that we have to ask ourselves, does it fundamentally invalidate some of the decisions in the deck in a major way by cutting it down on quantity? And I actually don't think that's true, which is super weird. But this deck is actually, it's often winning off of the just like Soraka Tahm Kench game plan. sometimes, I mean, TF is flippable here because we actually have a lot of cheap draws if they can't kill it. And we have a protection racket. Like, usually the win is the engines. And here's the thing. Double drawing Starspring is really bad. It's actually insanely bad. It's hard to explain. If you've played this deck a lot, if you played a lot, you'll know how bad drawing the second Starspring feels. It's insanely bad. Especially, like, there's some rare hands where it ends up being okay, but it is basically completely useless. It is almost unusable. It's basically unusable. And what that means is, like, man, it's a danger running 3F. So we have to juggle the power level versus the danger of double drawing. And this, by the way, Divergent Paths, I'm very confident Divergent Paths is absolutely trash in this list for that reason. I don't want to run a 4th Starspring, let alone a worse 4th Starspring. And, you know, playing this deck a lot, the more I play it, because I've played it a lot and I've seen it played a lot, it's mostly winning off of, like, the engine stabilization. Starspring is kind of like almost a matchup specific tech card. And I'm thinking, okay, so it could be 2 of, right? It could be a 2 of. A lot of people, I think there's one thing that people say that goes around a lot, which is if you need to draw it early, you should run more copies of the card. And that's, like, not really true. If it's a busted card that wins you the game if you draw it early, then you should run more copies of it. But that's kind of because you want to run busted cards, right? Like, I think in general that ends up being true in terms of, like, a curve reasoning. Like, if it's a cheap card, running more cheap cards is better for your curve than running more expensive cards. That's true. But this notion of, I hear a lot of people say, and people were commenting when we were cutting down Starsprings, people were commenting, you know, it's either a 0 of or a 3 of. Because it's like, if you're not running for the game plan, why run it at all? And that logic just doesn't really work here. It does work for, like, high synergy deck build logic, but at the end of the day, our game plan is still stabilizing off of, you know, the early units, and we're still, you know, triggering Soraka level up quite quickly, and we still have, you know, again, the deck building cost. It's a high synergy deck, but the deck building cost is eaten by the fact that we are not all in on Starspring compared to other components. Think about it like this, okay? This is kind of be my final point. I've explained this in a lot of different ways, but I think it's really integral to understand this. Right? So here's, like, the final summary to kind of, like, all the points I'm making, which is this, okay? And I am going to need to whip out the paint on this one. When you have this concept of synergy, synergy is multiplicative. We've got 2 fundamental concepts here. One is this and one is this. This is value. We call this additive property. And we've got synergy, which is multiplicative, which leads to usually these divergent game plans, or, you know, one side of the combo needs to interact with another side of the combo, right? It's kind of how it works. These are the 2 fundamental things that are happening in the game. And you'll see this reflected in different metas. In metas where it's very value oriented, you'll see decks that are built in a very linear way, whereas synergy metas have interesting deck building and polarizing matchups. It's upsides and downsides. Here's the thing about multiplication. It's actually really easy to understand mathematically. Just draw a fucking box, okay? And I've explained this before, but when you have any sort of multiplicative concept, draw a box. One side of the box represents, let's not use that. That's kind of confusing. One side of the box represents width and one side represents length. And the value of this synergy, because it's a multiplicative concept, can be roughly summarized as the area of the box, right? It's that simple. It actually is that simple. So let me go ahead and give you a random example. I'll use a very, very basic example. But here's the idea. We have a late game control deck, right? A late game control deck, and you want a certain amount of survival tools and a certain amount of payoff to the survival, right? This is the easiest example. It's the example I always use because it's not even like a fundamental archetype. It's just the notion of a stall or control deck in general. And every deck that plays slow has to obey this law, right? We have a box. So we can have a deck. Maybe let's look at different versions of decks. But here's the trick. To maximize area, when you're multiplying a rectangle, you want it to be as close to a square as possible. It's that easy. When you're dealing with, you have in the deck builder these two different sides, right? Let's say one side is going to be, these are my early survival tools. So let's call this S for survival. And this side is going to be my payoff, or P. You want to balance them. It's that simple. And this is just a way of visualizing it. And there's some weird concepts that you can get into, like more than 2 dimensions if you think about it in different ways. We're going to go with 2-dimensional now just because this is the easiest way to understand it. But the most important thing to understand is that it's not judging a quantity of cards. It's kind of judging like an average value per card, right? Some decks will be a perfectly balanced square just by running like Ledger's Atrocity and then 34 survival cards. In some metas, something like that will happen, right? So you're not looking at the amount of cards. You're just looking at trying to balance the survival conditions versus the payoff conditions. Because if you have too much survival, if you put, like, let's say this is a perfect square. Let's say it's a 7x7. So our value is, 49 or whatever. So if we have, let's say we skew it too much for survival and it's not enough for payoff. A good example of this would be like a pure Anivia deck, right? So let's say we go +3 here for survival to 10, and let's say we go to 4 here, down to 4 for 40, we end up with like 40 value. And this is like, I don't know. I think it's kind of interesting that just because you have two constituent components that are effectively working together in terms of trying to not just provide value when combined with each other, but also as tools to reliably draw like one half or the other, you need to think about it. You don't need this example, but I think it's kind of fun to think about it in this way. This isn't how you should think about it, but this is a good way to start understanding it. So here's what you have to understand next, which is that, again, like I said, we're not talking about individual cards. We're talking about cards as like a subcategory of cards of things, right? So like, for example, in discard aggro, when we were building that before, we had to balance a few factors. Let's keep it simple and let's say 2. But the factors we're balancing are discard payoff, or let's say the factors we're balancing are like swarm and swarm payoff or something like that, right? And that's why, obviously this is kind of like how you have to approach building the deck. You want an equal amount swarm payoff. And that's exactly why I was talking about why Daring Poro was so good. Not Daring Poro, Poro Cannon. Because it has the flexibility of being either, which is insane. It's fundamentally, the fact that it breaks this entire system wide open just by being either side. Whenever you have a combo where there's a card that can be either side that you need, it's ridiculous. It's always broken. What are good examples of that happening in Runeterra? What are good examples of that? Do you guys, I can't think of like too many off the top of my head. Draven is a good one as a card. I'm still thinking about discard aggro just because it gives you the axes, which could be discards or that could be discard fodder, right? That's kind of crazy. And here's the final thing. Here's the point I'm getting to with all this. What we have to do is we have to take, just like thinking about it in this term, and like look at this deck and how this deck is winning games. If this was a Starspring deck, the axis we would have is like, okay, what we'd have to be thinking about is like, okay, this is one side. So this is like basically, drawing Starspring. And then we everything else is like basically ways of getting it to work, right? Either making it more reliable in one way or another. And in that kind of deck, you would absolutely run Divergent Paths. And you would absolutely run 3 Starsprings. Here's the problem, though, which is kind of like, that's not how this deck actually ends up working out. What it really is kind of like a pure... I think it's better... Well, obviously, any model is going to be an oversimplification to a degree, but it's more so a deck that's built around sticking some kind of engine and winning off of it, with different engines having different amounts of synergy, right? So like, for example, Starspring is a good combo with Soraka. It levels Soraka a little bit faster. You know, Tom Kench and Soraka are good combos. We want our different engines to be comboing together, but none of them are actually necessary to winning the game on their own. And Starspring is actually kind of only wins pretty specific matchups and pretty specific hand states. The best states for Starspring are like War Mothers. That kind of deck is kind of where Starspring ends up being maybe your win condition, right? And so like when you think about it like that, so think about it as like, okay, every card has these diminishing returns, big diminishing returns in Starspring's case. And think about it like, okay, so one half of my deck is an engine, let's say an engine that I'm trying to enable or stick, and the others are enablers. I'm just going to write E for enabler, which is confusing because the engine starts with E. And engines are like 3 Soraka, it could be 2 or 3 Tom Kench, depending on your version. Let's just say 3 Tom Kench, because that's the normal version. We don't really need to run TF. You know, we've got 3 Tom Kench, and then we've got potential like stabilizer tool. Like against aggro, you can consider Broadback kind of like the same thing, because Broadback basically wins you the game against aggro if they can't kill it. So like, and that's a lot of the matchups right now. So yeah, I mean, let's call 3 Broadback, and then suddenly you've got 2 Starspring. So instead of 3 Starspring, we're going from like 12 down to 11, because again, we're lumping these all as win conditions. And that's the thing, like, it's not a deck that uses Starspring to win. That's just not what it is. Double drawing Starspring is awful. Drawing Starspring without drawing one of the primary engines is bad. And, you know, it's a tight deck. It's a high synergy deck. We do want to fit more stuff in. By the way, the multiplication addition thing is why synergy decks are tighter than value decks, slot-wise, which intuitively should make sense, because of course, you know, when you're playing for each individual point in like multiplication, like combo pieces, you're going to have less wiggle room for like any individual card, right? There's a lot of things that just can't go. And suddenly I'm like, don't get me wrong, I'm kind of using this as an example to talk about how I think about deck building. It's a meta call. Like, there are some metas where you will run 3 Starsprings, and I can also say there's some metas where you're gonna run 0. I can't give you an answer for how many Starsprings to run, but what I can tell you is it's not a 3 of auto include. The deck doesn't fall apart when you cut 1 or 2 or 3, and that you have to be thinking about it flexibly in these ways. That's it. That's kind of my only point here. And I know that's gonna seem like anticlimactic to a lot of you guys, because like you might have been wanting like some kind of conclusion or some kind of proof, but it's just the most important is like the way of thinking about it, and this idea of like how much my diminishing returns are going to cost me, right? It doesn't really matter that we're not like drawing it too early in that cases. If we're running 3 Starsprings, we might have to be on like a really awkward build of the deck, but everything in the deck is still the way it wants to be, right? No matter how many Starsprings we're running. We can talk about like, you know, mulliganing away as well. That's all just like, you know, a flexible aspect. And I can say that, you know, in a version like this, part of the, you know, once you cut like 1 Starspring, then suddenly the 3rd Tom Kench is a lot better, because it's more of like it's kind of like the same exchange, right? Like when we cut Starspring for an early stabilizer, that can let us cut Twisted Fate for the 3rd Tom Kench and kind of have a more balanced deck that isn't like losing as much to aggression. We take out 1 swap here and then the other swap there, right? I'm kind of like losing my core explanation. But yeah, that's kind of like the most important way to think about this deck. I wanted to talk more about like ratioing of cards. I think in this video and the last one, I've kind of like explained it decently well, at least. But I think a lot of people really just don't think too much about what ratioing is, especially with spells. There's a lot of spells that I'll run 1-ofs and people will be like, oh, that's weird. But in reality, it's just like, especially in a tournament where maybe there's open deck lists, running more higher densities of 1-ofs makes more sense, because your opponent has to play around more things. Which it might sound kind of weird at first, but it does make sense. And yeah, that's kind of just ratio deciding in a nutshell. There's very few things that are hard limits. One final point I'll make is that, so Soraka's champ spell sucks, but I think Soraka ends up being, at least like for how the matchup tables in the current meta are in my head, everything's meta dependent. Soraka, in my opinion, ends up being kind of like more, kind of like sort of central to the entire deck building concept here. So the deck feels a lot worse when we don't draw Soraka, as opposed to when we don't draw Tahm Kench. So even though Soraka's champ spell is bad, in fact, it's basically just as bad as Tahm Kench's. Might be worse, might be better. It's about the same. It's worth risking double drawing her there because her inherent value is worth more, and the way the deck is built is more around Soraka than Tahm Kench. Now, that falls apart. The 2 of Tahm Kench falls apart in a meta where you need 3 Tahm Kenches, but that's more meta dependent, whereas Soraka is more like centric on how this deck is built.